Welcome, everybody, into the inaugural edition of the Top Tier Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Ian McKinney. Today, we've got a great show for you guys. We got an interview with K.URE's Cael Sleezer. Comes to give or take the midpoint in today's show. It's a fantastic interview. But first things first, it is time for my college football playoff predictions. And I gotta be honest with you guys. The first thing I thought of when coming up with the idea for the Top Tier Sports Podcast, this was the first topic I got really excited about. So I'm just super excited to dive into it. So for those of you who don't know, the semifinals for the college football playoff have been determined. It's going to be Alabama, Notre Dame, and the Rose Bowl. However, the Rose Bowl is actually going to take place in Arlington, Texas, over at Jerry World because of COVID protocol in the state of California. And in the other semifinal, it's going to be Clemson and Ohio State. Now, before I really dive into each game individually, I do want to preface this by saying I do think this is the correct bracket. I don't think I saw enough from A&M prove to me that they are better than Notre Dame. Notre Dame did not look like a playoff-worthy team in that ACC. Let's just be honest, absolute demolition at the hands of Clemson. But at the same time, I do think that Notre Dame and Texas A&M are really approximate equivalents in terms of the likelihood that they'll beat Alabama. It's just that I think Notre Dame's win over Clemson trumps Texas A&M's win over Florida. Now, personally, based off of what I saw in that SEC championship game, I do think that Florida is probably a top 4 team in the country, but just because you're never going to get into the playoff with 3 losses, and especially a just bad loss against LSU. So, long story short, this is the 4 that if I were in the committee's shoe, I would have them in. I know some people argued for Cincinnati, but just in my opinion, the Bearcats, at least in the games that I watched, they didn't really wow me too much. And I'm a big eye test guy, so I think that for a group of 5 team, there were just too many other good options. So I had to leave the Bearcats out of this one. But now that the prefacing is over, time to jump into both of the games and eventually the national title game on a more individual, in-depth basis. So I guess I'll start with or at least in my opinion, the less intriguing game of the two being Notre Dame versus Alabama in the Rose Bowl. And I'm just going to be honest, I just don't really see a path to victory for Notre Dame. I just don't. Now, obviously, it is 2020, or I guess 2021 by the time the game takes place on New Year's Day. Yes, there could be COVID or something, but as of how the rosters stand right now, I just don't see it for Notre Dame. I'm a firm believer that to win in this day and age, you have to have a top 5 quarterback in the country. Or you've got to have somebody who is just on an absolute tear in terms of accuracy and just being efficient. So 2014 Ohio State, Cardell Jones was their quarterback. Remember, that was the year Braxton Miller got hurt preseason. JT Barrett got hurt in the Michigan game. Then Cardell Jones came in. He's obviously was not a top 5 quarterback in the country at that time, but he got hot at the right times and he made plays, and Ohio State's got a championship because of it. The next year you had the first Alabama championship team who were led by Coker at quarterback. Now, Coker was not a top 5 quarterback. I'd say he's probably the one exception to this rule, but I do think Coker was probably top 15 quarterback in the country. I think he was drastically underrated, and obviously when you've got Lane Kiffin as offensive coordinator, that'll definitely help fix a lot of your problems. And obviously, Derrick Henry was just ridiculous in college, and he still, quite frankly, is. Next year was Clemson with Deshaun Watson. I don't really think I need to go into too much detail here. I mean, really, from the beginning, Watson was a stud. And very, very clearly a top 5 quarterback, if not the best quarterback. So he fits that definition. Next year was the year that Bama made that big comeback against Georgia. Tua, it's hard to tell if he was a top 5 quarterback at that time, obviously. But I mean, the dude was just on an absolute tear regardless. So he fits that. Then the year after that, we had Clemson, where they absolutely mashed Alabama in the championship game. Trevor Lawrence there. I mean, Trevor Lawrence, top 5 quarterback from the minute he stepped on campus. I don't really think many people would argue that. And then obviously last year, you had the greatest single season for a college football team ever with Joe Burrow. I don't think anybody's going to argue that he wasn't the best quarterback last year, let alone top 5. So then let's stick with that theme and apply it to this game. Mac Jones, I could see an argument for that. I mean, at the bare minimum, people will say he's a great game manager, right? He deserves credit for that. And the fact of the matter is that Ian Book can't be a game man, and he's not a top 5 quarterback. So for that reason, I don't think that Notre Dame can win the championship, and I don't think they can get past Alabama. And then it goes past quarterback. If you look at weapons, okay, let's take a look at wide receiver. Notre Dame's got McKinley, who's good, but really he's a bit hot and cold. You've got it, who, in my opinion, should win the Heisman Trophy, and Devontae Smith, who is, I mean, you could probably quintuple cover him and he'd probably still find a way to get open. You've got Najee Harris in the backfield to deal with. And you've got a solid offensive line that's going to give him time. I don't see how Notre Dame is going to be able to keep up with that offensively. And yes, Alabama's defense struggled against Florida's offense, but I would be surprised if there weren't NFL teams that would struggle with Florida's offense. Everybody has struggled with it, and I don't really think that that's really too fair to look at. Notre Dame just is not built to beat this Alabama team. So for that reason, I think that Alabama's going to come out. People were saying like 3 touchdowns. I think that's about right for Alabama. So I see the Crimson Tide not only winning this game, but winning this game pretty convincingly. And now we'll shift our attention quickly to the other semifinal, which, in my opinion, is going to be a bit more interesting. So that'll pit Ohio State against Clemson for the second year in a row. Rematch of the classic Fiesta Bowl from last year. But I think that these two teams are very, very different from last year's. Going into this year, I was as big of Ohio State stan as anybody. I had them ranked #1 preseason. I thought that they were going to be the best team in college football. I thought they were going to be what Alabama is. But unfortunately for my predictions, they're unfortunately not. And Clemson kind of did the opposite. I thought Clemson might take a little bit of a step back, but they proved me wrong. Trevor Lawrence, I used to think he was a bit overrated. That dude's a star. And I just don't think that Ohio State is going to be able to keep up with them. Ohio State looks great one game, like in the Michigan State game, but then they look subpar and just lackluster in another game, the Northwestern game, for example. And I think that comes down to play calling. Trey Sermon had over 350 yards in the Big Ten championship game. So why would you ever think about throwing it? But that's what the issue was the first half. They were getting whatever they wanted on the ground. But for some reason, they just kept calling passes. And I think that regardless of if it's pro or college, the difference between good coaches and great coaches is great coaches adapt their system to the players, and good coaches make their players adapt to them. And Ryan Day is trying to make that offense adapt to the passing-friendly offense that he wants to run. And I just don't think that Ohio State can do that. And especially, I think Clemson's going to come out with a chip on their shoulder. I think they feel disrespected. I think they feel like they're the #1 team in the country. I think that this game is going to be a lot bigger of a win for Clemson than the last one. I think it's going to be 10 points, seems about right. So I think Clemson is going to win pretty convincingly in this one. Now, I do want to make sure that people recognize there is a differentiation between this game and the Notre Dame Alabama game, where I just don't see a path to victory for Notre Dame. I do for Ohio State, though. You know, Justin Fields has been wildly inconsistent this entire year. Even within games, he's been inconsistent. I mean, first half of the IU game, he looked like he was going to continue to look like a Heisman candidate, and then the second half, let's just say he did not. If we see the good Justin Fields, the Michigan State game Justin Fields, the first half of the Indiana game, then I think Ohio State's got a good shot. Because you can't afford to have a one-dimensional offense. Not in the playoff. And especially not against this Clemson team who's got one of the best defenses in the country. And I think, based off of what I saw last week, they hopefully got the run game fixed up. If you're not going to get it fixed after 350 yards of offense, I don't know what will. I think that if they can get the good Justin Fields, they do have a shot, but I'm just not going to bet on it. Ohio State's been too inconsistent for me this year. I'm going to take the Tigers by 10. And of course, last but not least, the national championship game. So in review, I've got Alabama over Notre Dame by 3 touchdowns. And in the other semifinal, I've got Clemson over Ohio State by 10. So that'll set up once again Clemson versus Alabama for the 100th time, it feels like. So this one, I think this is going to be an all-time classic. I mean, two great offenses going at it. I'd say Clemson probably has the quarterback advantage. Alabama's got the weapons advantage. And I really think it's going to come down to running back. Which running back can make the most difference? I think that in this game, the defenses aren't going to matter too much. And I think everything else is about even. So running back, Etienne or Najee Harris. And in this one, I just think Najee Harris is just too good. I think Najee Harris is the best running back in the country. Etienne's probably a better pass-catching back than Najee is. But I just think that for what Bama's going to need out of him in this game, I can't think of somebody better than Najee Harris to fill that role. And not only that, Najee is just so tough. He reminds me a little bit of David Montgomery for the Bears in the NFL. David Montgomery never goes down on first contact, ever. And that is very much the case for Najee Harris as well. He's just so tough, so gritty. It's what you would want in a running back. And I'm very much a passing offense kind of a guy. I love to watch like the air raid and all that stuff. And the fact that I think a running back is this good, I think says something. And I just think that because of that, I've got Alabama by 3 in this eventual matchup. So I've got the Crimson Tide taking it. I think that it's going to be a high-scoring game. I'd probably say I'm going to go with 38-35. Alabama taking it. And so that is my pick for this year's national champion. A reminder that later on, we've still got an interview with the one, the only Cael Sleezer coming up, but not before we take a quick break. We'll be back right after this. And welcome back, folks. Joining me now is going to be contributor to K.URE, Mr. Cael Sleezer. Welcome to the pod. So, Cael, I'm just going to jump straight into it. Looking at, as the season has finally come to a close in this interesting 2020 world, looking through the landscape of college football, sort of what are your thoughts on it at the moment?
Gee, Ian, where to start? This year has been, we can blame COVID all we want, and it's mainly true for the absolute mess that college football has been this year. But the Pac-12 and the Big Ten starting games late and then having many of them postponed or canceled or a little bit of all of the above. A lot of teams have opted out of bowls. Like, I believe Notre Dame at one point said that they would opt out of the college football playoff if there were no fans, which greatly shocked me. But as far as the college football playoff setup this year, again, COVID has thrown everything off, and it's tough for the committee to decide who is deserving and who's not, with everybody playing anywhere between 6 to 11 games. Iowa State ended up playing 11 games, and who was it? Ohio State only played 6. So it's very, very tough. I think it's very hard to dispute that Alabama's the number 1 team in the country. I think they're number 1. I have no bone to pick with that. And then as far as Clemson and Notre Dame, they just swapped losses after it was all said and done. And I agree with Clemson being second because that one loss was without Trevor Lawrence at QB. It was DJ Uiagalelei. I'm sure I butchered that last name somehow. But it wasn't a terrible loss for Clemson because they didn't have Trevor Lawrence. I do agree with Clemson being second. Now, here's where I start having some issues. I can understand the playoff committee not wanting to have a Clemson-Notre Dame Part 3 matchup unless they meet in the national championship. That I can understand. So that's why Clemson was second and Notre Dame was fourth. I don't think Ohio State should not be third. I don't even think they should be in this playoff. Yes, they have Justin Fields, and yes, they won their Big Ten championship game, but they only played 6 games. There are many other deserving teams in the country that played almost twice as many games as Ohio State. One of those teams was Coastal Carolina. They finished their season 11-0. They were scheduled to – they had a few postponements, but they made those postponements up, and they were scheduled to play Louisiana, who was ranked, and actually beat Iowa State earlier in the year. They were a bit slept on, that Louisiana team, earlier in the year, but they have been a formidable opponent. And Coastal Carolina already beat them once. And I think a lot of non-Power 5 schools kind of got the short end of the stick this year. Coastal Carolina being one of them. And then Cincinnati. Cincinnati had such a great year. All of their wins, most of their wins were by a fair margin of points. Like I'm looking at their schedule right now. I see a 55-20 win. I see a 42-13, 49-10, 38-10, 55-17. Their smallest margin of victory was 3 points on 2 occasions, one to Central Florida and one to Tulsa. But me and my family, I'm just going to say that we're biased on the angle. We do not like Big Ten football. We don't think that the Big Ten is anywhere near the level of Big 12 football as a whole. And I think the Big Ten has altered a lot of their bowl requirements. Like I think they tweaked like days coming back for Ohio State so they could play in their game. And I really do think that the college football playoff needs to be expanded to 8 teams as soon as possible because there's so many deserving teams out there that don't really get looked at closely enough, like Coastal Carolina and Cincinnati, like I previously mentioned. I just don't think that a 4-team playoff does justice to the college football landscape as a whole.
So real quickly, Cael, before we move on, it seems like the national media, at least, their big argument was between Texas A&M versus Notre Dame getting into the playoff. But it seems like you have more of a bone to pick with Ohio State actually getting into the playoff rather than Notre Dame. Would you mind elaborating on that a little bit?
And I don't think Ohio State should have made it. Yes, they are good, but I don't think they should have made it because they only played 6 games. And me and my family, we kind of dug into some of the stats. The 5th-ranked Texas A&M team, they only lost the 1 game, but they only had 2 wins for opponents with records above 500. And they were ranked 5th in the whole country. And then you have Oklahoma, who started off the season poorly, but shot back up at the end and then had that nail-biting win to Iowa State. I'm not going to go in depth on that because that will just hurt me too much as an Iowa State fan. I just don't think the 4-team playoff structure does justice. And who doesn't want more football? Everybody wants more football. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that they could have done some things better this year. I know it's hard to judge this season on records and win-loss and win percentage with all the COVID stuff that's gone on, but I just don't think Ohio State had enough of a push at the end because they were favored over Northwestern in the Big Ten championship by like 20 points. And it was kept within a one-possession game until about 4 minutes left. So Ohio State greatly underperformed for expectations in that Big Ten championship game.
So then who would you have in that, I'm assuming, 4 slot as opposed to Ohio State?
Yeah, I'm fine with Clemson, Notre Dame, and Alabama being in there. But as far as who would replace Ohio State, I instinctively want to say Texas A&M because they did have a good year. But again, they've only won 2 games with opponents having a record of 500 or better. And if I surf my trusty sports app here, let me look at A&M's schedule. They did manage to beat Florida earlier in the season. Their one loss was to Alabama. They lost pretty badly in that one. A&M did beat LSU and Auburn. LSU is not good this year, but they did beat Florida later in the year. And Auburn, they had a half-decent season. I think Texas A&M, I mean, they are technically the 5 seed in the college football playoff rankings. They were the first team out. If you go by the computer, they're the next team in. Oklahoma had a big surge at the end of the year. They dropped a handful of games early. One of them was to Iowa State, but then they got kind of what is known as a revenge victory in the Big 12 championship game when they beat Iowa State. Again, not going to go too in-depth to that because that will hurt me too much. But I think Oklahoma is definitely a candidate in that one. And then Florida, I would say Florida, but they should not have lost that game to LSU. Like, you can't throw a cleat 20 yards down the field with less than a minute left after a third down. I don't know. I'm blanking on his name, but I don't know what that Florida defender was thinking. Like, how can you do that to your team? I know I was an athlete in high school. I know how adrenaline can kick in and you could do some things that you might not otherwise do. But in that situation and that big of a game, you just can't do that. And even if Florida would have hung on to win that game, it still shouldn't have been that close. Because as I said earlier, LSU was not anywhere near their championship caliber season last year. Yes, they lost a lot of players, but their overall structure was the same, and they still had Orgeron and head coach. And I think that LSU should have been like a low teens, high 20s ranked team this year coming off of their national championship season. But LSU just underperformed, but they came back and beat Florida, which hurts their playoff resume. And I'm going to go back to Cincinnati. They had a fantastic year. They haven't lost a game yet this season. I think they should be considered more so for a playoff spot because they've beat some decent teams as well. I'm going to go back to their schedule and run over who they beat again. They beat Tulsa, who was a ranked team. They beat Memphis, who was ranked earlier in the season. And they just dominated almost every single game they played this year. Like, it wasn't even close. Most of their games, they won by 2 possessions or more, except for these last 2 against Central Florida and Tulsa. But those are 2 very good teams, and they managed to edge those at the end. So I think Cincinnati needs to get more respect. There are a lot of good suitors for this playoff, Ian, and it just hurts to see so many good teams this year just not make this playoff and see an Ohio State team that played half of the games as some of these deserving teams did make the playoffs. And with them flopping a little bit in that Big Ten championship game, I just think there's a lot of teams out there that are more deserving than Ohio State. Again,
Hmm.
COVID sucks. It affected a lot of things, but with all that said and done, I just think that Ohio State shouldn't have made that playoff.
So now that, for better or for worse, the playoff is set, it's going to be Bama versus Notre Dame and Clemson, Ohio State, in the two respective semifinals. So on January 11th, when the big clocks hit double zeros, what team do you think is going to be holding up the championship trophy?
Well, we've seen a lot in the few years this college football playoff's been up. It's a lot of chalk, meaning that the higher seeds win a majority of the time. And I think we're going to see that again in the semifinals. I don't see Notre Dame beating Alabama. Alabama's favored in that game by 19 and a half. I think that's just going to be an absolute blowout. Ian Book and Notre Dame, they're good, but they are not good enough to beat Ohio State or Alabama, excuse me. Alabama, they went undefeated, and I see them in the championship over Notre Dame easy. As far as the Clemson Ohio State game, that point spread is much smaller. Clemson is favored by 7.
Mm-hmm.
Ohio State has not lost a game in the matchups they've played, but again, they flopped a little against a Northwestern team in the middle of the pack as far as the top 25 rankings. And Clemson, as far as I know right now, they've got everybody healthy. They've got Etienne at running back, and then Trevor Lawrence, who is pretty much all said and done the number 1 overall pick in the draft for next year.
Mm-hmm.
I see Clemson winning this game. It might be close, but I just don't see Ohio State topping Clemson in that game. I see another Clemson Alabama championship matchup. And as far as that championship game, that's going to be a good one. Because correct me if I'm wrong, Alabama was the loser in last year's championship game, correct? Or was it
No, Clemson.
Clemson? Clemson did lose that game last year. Okay. My memory's a bit fuzzy on that one. I just remember Joe Burrow and LSU dominating whoever they faced.
Yeah.
But Alabama, Clemson, those two teams have by far had the most experience in these college football playoffs. These playoffs have been going since 2014, I believe. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of people screaming Mac Jones for Heisman because Lawrence was out for so long. But Trevor Lawrence is Trevor Lawrence. It's not a smart move to bet against him in any situation. He's proven that he can win national championships. He's won a Heisman. And the Alabama squad, offensively and defensively, they're good. But I just don't see Mac Jones, who's a good quarterback, but he's not on Trevor Lawrence's level. I see Clemson winning this national championship because they had a lot of COVID cases earlier in the year, and that's a reason why they lost that one game to Notre Dame. So I see Clemson winning the whole thing here, Ian.
So while we're sort of on the topic, you did address the Heisman race there for a quick moment. I want to take a bit of a deeper look at that. So the 4 finalists have been announced. It's going to be Kyle Trask, Devontae Smith, Mac Jones, and obviously Trevor Lawrence. So in your opinion, who do you think deserves to take home this year's Heisman?
Well, a lot of the season, my favorite for Heisman was Kyle Trask for Florida. And then he had that game against LSU where he turned the ball over something like 3 times and then couldn't beat a subpar LSU Tigers team. And that, combined with Trevor Lawrence being out for a few weeks, that's going to hurt Lawrence's stats. And Mac Jones has been in there all year. So all those names I mentioned, Jones, Lawrence, and Trask, I think those are the 3 favorites for Heisman. And I'm just going to give a little bit of praise to Breece Hall for Iowa State. I know he's not going to win the Heisman, but I don't think he's gotten enough credit for what he's done. He led the country in so many rushing categories, and I believe the smallest amount of rushing yards he had in a game was somewhere in the low 90s. So I'm going to give Breece Hall a little bit of credit just because I'm an Iowa State fan and they're taking my money. So I have to credit them a little bit. I don't think Breece Hall has gotten enough discussion for Heisman. He's not going to win it by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think he's gotten enough credit as far as that discussion. So with that being said, my pick for Heisman right now is probably going to be Trevor Lawrence because he just has more name recognition and he was the favorite going into the year.
Mm-hmm.
And even though he was out a few weeks with COVID, he's really bounced back. And he, along with the whole Clemson team, they thumped Notre Dame in that ACC championship. So that will definitely help his Heisman resume. And again, Mac Jones is good. I don't think he gets quite enough credit, but he's just not on the same level as Trevor Lawrence. So I think Trevor Lawrence wins that Heisman again.
So, for those of you listening, Cael is obviously an Iowa State fanatic, and there's been a lot made of Cyclones headman Matt Campbell potentially moving on, being rumored that the Michigan job was rumored at the Auburn job before it was taken. So, let's suppose that Campbell does eventually leave the Iowa State program. Where would you like to see him coach next?
Well, that's a hard question. I wouldn't like to see him anywhere other than Iowa State. But again, your scenario, Ian, if I had to pick a place where Campbell would go somewhere else, I'd want to see him with that Chicago Bears offense. Because, first of all, David Montgomery, Iowa State alum, is really shining out in the NFL the last few weeks. Matt Nagy has really not done well overall as the Bears coach. He stopped the offensive play calling a few weeks ago. And since then, David Montgomery has had 3 100-yard rushing games in 4 games.
Mm-hmm.
And with Matt Campbell, somebody who he's familiar with him coaching Montgomery, I think we could see Montgomery with a 1,200-yard rushing season next year. He's going to break 1,000 yards this year if he keeps going on the pace he's going. But with Matt Campbell as coach in Chicago, I could see Montgomery getting up to 1,400 yards on the ground alone next year.
Well, as a Bears fan, I'm certainly not going to complain if that's who Chicago decides to hire. And so I just like to once again thank you for coming on the show. It was a ton of fun, and I'd love to have you back on again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, that was K.URE's Cael Sleezer joining us. And that's going to wrap up today's edition of the Top Tier Sports podcast. Remember, Top Tier Sports is always available online. Just check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. In addition, we are also available on social media. I mean everything. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, you name it, we're on it. So check us out on all of those platforms. Join us again next time and have an absolutely fantastic day, everybody.